Our third speaker finished his bachelor's degree at Ankara University and his master's degree at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and his PhD at the University of Chicago. Among the positions he held are as lecturer of the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, professor of philosophy at the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization at Kuala Lumpur, and professor of philosophy at the Department of Philosophy at Fatih University in Istanbul. At present, he is the director of the Institute of Social Sciences of this university, Yıldız Technical University. Among his publications are Philosophy of Knowledge, Being and Existence in Sadra and Heidegger, a Comparative Ontology, Islamic Science Towards a Definition, Scientific Thought and Its Burdens, Islam and Science, and Evaluation from the Perspective of History and Philosophy of Science. He will talk to us about the concept of urf, or local culture, in Islamic legal philosophy, and Nursi's solution for social harmony and world peace. I would like to welcome Professor Alparslan Açıkgenç.
Thank you very much. I think I'm in trouble because both speakers, they followed meticulously their time. I hope I will be able to finish also in 20 minutes. This morning, the concept of globalization, the phenomenon of globalization, mentioned quite a lot. And I have been thinking about this. I tried to come up with a new interpretation of certain past historical events in Islamic civilization. And also, I would like to present my own insight into the philosophy of Islamic law, and then bring that background to some of the things that Nursi said in relation to the solutions they offered, not in relation to the actual material that I will bring up here. I would like to present the history of Islamic civilization maybe as an example for globalization, perhaps in a restricted sense. Because Islam, when it started spreading, it spread quite rapidly. And within a very short time, perhaps 50 years or so, its borders expanded all the way from Spain to China, quite a large area. And as a result, you can see within all these areas, there are many cultures, local cultures, that came under the domination of the Muslim, I don't like to use this word, but if we use the word empire, under the Muslim empire. So this brought some problems, of course. The problem of globalization, in fact. Why? Because there is a religion, and the religion wants to preserve its identity, but at the same time, the religion wants to preserve the local cultures. And how to do that? And why are they trying to preserve the local cultures? In a sense, maintaining a multicultural society and multi-religious as well. There are some verses in the Quran that puts this as an obligation on Muslims. For example, I'll just read one of them. In the chapter 35, verse number 28, the creation of the heaven and of the earth, and diversity of your languages and colors are God's signs. Surely in this are signs for those who know. So in the Quran, the cultural differences, differences of people, differences of languages are identified as signs of God. Sign here means, the Arabic word for it is ayah, because the Quranic verses are also called signs. The same word are used for both of them. Because a sign points to something, So, therefore, the diversity of people actually shows to God, indicates this. The first speaker, Colin, very eloquently, he expressed his ma'nai harfi, the indicative sense of the universe and existence, is also reflected in the society. So the society has this indicative nature, and therefore shows and leads, in fact, to the Supreme Being. As a result, Muslims were supposed to preserve that difference. And that difference could be language, culture, race, faith, different religions. But how to do that? That was a big problem, of course, in the early community. Let me read again one other verse in chapter 5, verse 48. Says, if God willed, He could have made you one single nation, but He willed to test you in what He bestowed upon you. Compete with one another in good works, because you shall all return ultimately to God. So, as you can see, the Quranic outlook is to preserve that multiplicity, no matter in what respect it can be maintained. Muslim lawyers, they try to develop some principles and certain legal methodology in order to cope with this problem. They offered a lot of solutions. I would like to classify them, and this classification, I would like to say, is against the classical. It's not, I'm not going to reject it, but I would like to reshuffle in order to bring it to our time, so we can maybe utilize in solving certain issues that we face with globalization. And I would like to classify these different legal opinions under three headings. The first thing, they all accepted, without any exception, the foundation of the law. As the foundation, obviously, they accepted, like in all other things, the Quran and the prophetic tradition, the Sunnah in the Arabic word, or the Hadith. So these two are, without exception, accepted as the ground, the foundation of the law. The law will proceed from that, and therefore it will derive its methodology and its philosophical spirit from these two sources only. And this is accepted without exception by all jurists and lawyers. They offered some other things also as a foundation, but then they don't agree. So as a result, I take it out from that. I would like to call as sources of law. So, because you see, once they established their philosophy, the spirit of the law, on the basis of these two foundations, then they needed some sources also to derive new laws. One of those sources is called urf in Arabic. Its literal translation into English is customs, local customs, in other words. And however, I would like to translate that as local culture, because customs, in fact, the main component of the culture. And since this is the main social phenomenon which really indicates the culture, I would like to bring that into our time as a local culture. Then they develop, I'm not discussing other sources because of the shortness of the time, other principles they developed, I would like to call them the objectives of the law. Okay, we have the foundation, and we are now able, we have many sources from which we can derive the law, but then towards which end? They identified the objectives also, which is called maqasid al-sharia, the objectives of the law. Now, these objectives I would like to classify under 3 headings. Number 1, and the most important one, is human dignity. The law should preserve human dignity. Because in the Quran, it is said that we have created the children of Adam in dignity. And therefore, they ought to be respected. So, human dignity is the utmost important significance in Islamic law as far as the objective is concerned. And the second thing is, of course, human freedom. This is very much emphasized also by the lawyers in their philosophy of law. And the third thing is human rights. Rights to believe, rights for private property, and rights for free expression of thought. So these are the main principles or objectives of the law. So we have a problem here. Out of this brief summary of the philosophy of Islamic law, how are we going to apply the concept of local culture or urf? Because if you try to emulate every local culture into Islam, it will destroy Islam, and therefore its nature will be totally destroyed. There will not be any unity in the Islamic creed. So they needed to develop this also, try to come up with new solutions. The most effective solution they came up with is try to have diversity in unity. So there will be something taken from Islam that will keep the unity, but at the same time within that unity you have the diversity of cultures. So if you say unity, that means there is something that should be the same wherever you go. It cannot be changed in every culture. Otherwise there will not be any unity. Obviously diversity means, okay, those things can change. You can do whatever you want as far as your local culture is concerned. So what is that which is the same? Of course, since the main principles and objectives of the Islamic law derive from the Quran, obviously the lawyers, they looked into the same idea, namely the creed that is given in the Quran. And the most basic one is, I'm not going to count all of them, but at least you can see one that gives a unity, is the idea of Tawheed. Tawheed itself in Arabic means unity. What does that mean? That means the belief in one God. The belief in one God. And anything that violates this principle should be omitted from the local cultures. And the local cultures should be clarified. Anything that endangers the idea of Tawheed. And there may be certain other things, other principles, religious life. But you see, we should also pay attention that, this preservation in unity is applied to Muslims only. Why? Because you remember, preserving local culture in the sense of freedom of faith, belief, means you cannot impose this on non-Muslims. So if you become a Muslim, you can bring anything from your local culture, but on the condition that it does not violate the idea of Tawheed and the basic principles connected to the Tawheed. So as a result, they were able to find in creed the main components that preserves the Islamic unity, and anything other than that, including, if you don't accept, because there is a principle even in the Quran that there is no coercion in religion. This is the main principle that the Quran cites. There is no coercion. So you cannot force someone to change her religion. It doesn't make even if it is Islam or not. But one thing is important, when Muslim lawyers, they put these principles, they don't use the word Islam. They don't use the word Islam, they use the word religion. So otherwise, again, it would destroy other faiths. And that is why non-Muslims were able to live under freedom in the Muslim, the conquered areas. And therefore, I mean, wherever you go today, even where the Muslims ruled for more than 500-700 years, you still find there local people who live there with the Muslims, and they preserve their own religion, and they are not Muslims mostly. So it did not destroy that. So this is then the part of the Islamic law. But you see, there is one more thing that we need to bring, and we usually forget that. If we develop law like this, one thing maybe I should indicate again, in many other, it could be that in other civilizations, perhaps they developed ideas in this sense, but really they did not develop it as a philosophy, a full-fledged philosophy of law. You see, in Islam, it was applied. It was applied, why? Because there is a law to protect it. And that law, all the way from the beginning, I mean, it did not develop just 200-300 years ago. It developed in the 2nd century of Islam, very early, quite early. In fact, the concepts were already there when the Quran came, because the concept of urf at least 2 times repeated in the Quran. So it is used in the main sources, and in the prophetic tradition also, the word is used and applied also. So, but the thing is, you have the law, but how are you going to force the law upon the people? One thing is that, of course, Muslim lawyers, they emphasize, but you see, the nature of the law is such that you don't pay so much attention to the spirit. Because law, you know, is very rigid. You need to apply it. So it doesn't really take much into consideration the human feelings, human effects. Who comes into the picture here? The spiritual thinkers like Nursi and many people before him, and of course the examples of the Prophet himself. The application of this law is based on human spiritual feelings, on human spirituality. It is not imposed upon people and upon the society, but rather it is the people are educated in such a way that they willingly run after this, and they see the beauty of this, and therefore they try to live in their life and reflect it on the society. So it is this picture that Nursi emphasizes. Because of this, he doesn't pay much about the matter of the law, and therefore in his writings you will not find much writings on law or philosophy of law. There are very few questions that people posed in front of him, and he tried to answer those questions. He paid attention more on the spirit of the law, the spiritual betterment of human beings. Why? Because this will make the law meaningful and applicable within the society. So in order to preserve the peace and the multicultural nature of the society, we need to educate the people. Because this, he never paid attention to the society as a whole. Because he thought that what makes up the society are the individuals. And therefore we should pay we should pay attention to the individuals and how to educate them in the spiritual sense. One example he gives is, paying attention to human nature. He makes an analogy that, human beings are very important creatures. They resemble, if you pay attention to the material aspect of human beings, then you will lose this importance. Because if you take an antique to the bazaar, to the market of the just regular people, where they just buy pieces of scraps and sell, you can sell that piece there maybe for $10 or so. but it's an antique. If you bring it to the market of the antiques, to the people who know its real value, then they will perhaps pay $1 million, $10 million, depending on its antiquity. So human beings are like that, he says. If you pay attention to their material body, it's like the scrap metal. It's just, flesh and bones, and that's all. But if you start looking at the feelings, the spiritual aspect of human being, then you will notice that this being is extremely important. And therefore, we should respect and try to utilize that aspect of human beings. How can we do that? He offers that, this of course will begin again with the idea of Tawhid, the knowing God. But three notions he develops in this respect. I will tell them in Arabic as he is using them, and then try to explain if I can. I have 1 or 2 minutes left, I think. The first concept is he calls Ma'rifatullah, and the second one is Muhabbatullah, and the third one is Levdeti Ruhaniye. So Ma'rifatullah is very important. If you literally translate, maybe it can be translated as our knowledge of God. But it really doesn't mean that simple thing, because it refers to actually the spiritual witnessing of God. So, because you try to develop this idea in your consciousness so much that through living an ethical life, a moral life, that you feel that you are with God all the time. And because of this, then you can see He turns to you, and then you begin to develop a certain affinity and closeness to God, which is expressed as the love of God. And what comes at the end, the result of this, is the spiritual witnessing and the spiritual pleasure. It brings that. This gives the individual what he calls spiritual satisfaction, itmi'nan, spiritual satisfaction in himself, and he becomes a moral being. A human being becomes a moral being, and he reflects it in his personality, and he reflects it towards the society. And therefore he becomes a tranquil person, a person who is in peace with himself and with others also. He tries to preserve peace in himself and in his surroundings and in his society. And this way the peace is achieved within the society. And if everyone tries to preserve this, perhaps this will lead to world peace in future. And in a very brief outline, thank you very much.